When HR called me in, they chose the smaller conference room, the one with frosted glass, and the artificial plant no one ever cleaned. At Aurelian Logistics Group, that room was reserved for conversations people didn't want witnessed. Two HR managers sat across from me with a printed document. Next to them was CEO Daniel Mercer, jacket off, sleeves slightly rolled, like he had personally worked through the decision. Before I tell you what happened in that room that scared the CEO, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. Let me know where you're listening from and how old you are. I'll read all the comments. Now let's see what they have to say. Due to restructuring, organizational realignment, shifting operational priorities, the language was familiar, carefully neutral, designed to remove accountability from the moment. I listened without interrupting. Daniel didn't look at me. He leaned back instead, fingers loosely interlocked, waiting for the script to finish. Then he spoke. "You're fired. Return all company property." A brief pause. "You're replaceable." That was it. No explanation, no discussion. I had expected to feel something anger, maybe frustration. Instead, there was only stillness. I nodded. No argument, no questions. I closed my laptop and placed it on the table. Then my badge, my access card, routine gestures, predictable ones. Then I reached into my coat pocket and placed 12 small brass keys on the table. They hit the surface with a sharp metallic sound louder than expected. HR stopped speaking. Daniel glanced at them, briefly confused, then dismissed it with a faint smirk. No one asked what they opened. No one understood what had just been placed in front of them. And I didn't explain. I have a small note: this is a fictional story. Some elements are supported by artificial intelligence. Its purpose is to entertain, educate, and share meaningful messages and thought-provoking experiences. I hope you will have a truly emotional experience. Please read to the end. The elevator doors closed quietly behind me, sealing off the room, the voices, the decision that had just been made as if it were final. For a moment, I stood there alone, watching the numbers light up one by one as I descended. There was no rush in my thoughts, no anger pushing its way to the surface, just a slow, steady awareness of what had actually happened. 7 years. That was the number that settled in my mind. 7 years of building systems no one ever talked about in meetings. Facilities no executive ever visited unless something went wrong. Warehouses that didn't appear in investor presentations, yet carried the weight of every deadline the company had promised to meet. At Aurelian Logistics Group, expansion had always been described as strategic growth, clean slides, confident forecasts, but the reality behind it had been quieter. Fragmented locations, secondary storage sites, overflow offices, secured units for proprietary equipment that couldn't be risked in the main headquarters. I had built that network piece by piece, not through departments, but through continuity. Most of the agreements weren't handled by legal teams cycling in and out. They were handled directly, negotiated with landlords who preferred one consistent point of contact instead of shifting corporate representatives. I became that point of contact, not because it was assigned, but because it worked. Over time, those agreements began to carry my name, not as ownership, but as authorization. It wasn't something anyone flagged as critical. It didn't appear on risk reports. It wasn't discussed in executive briefings. It simply existed, functioning quietly in the background, holding everything together without demanding attention. That was the nature of operational infrastructure, invisible when it worked, indispensable when it didn't. And as the elevator reached the ground floor, one thought became clear with unsettling precision. They hadn't removed a role. They had removed continuity. Outside the building, the air felt different, though nothing had really changed. People moved as usual. Conversations carried on. Cars passed without hesitation. It was the kind of normal that makes a moment like that feel almost unreal. I paused for a second near the entrance, not to look back, but to steady the quiet that had settled in. There was no surge of anger, no urge to prove anything. What lingered instead was a thin, persistent sense of loss, not for the position, not for the title, but for the assumption that effort and trust had been understood. I had given both without keeping score. That was the part that stayed with me. I walked toward the parking lot slowly, replaying nothing, analyzing nothing. There was no need. Everything had already been decided, just not entirely by them. My phone remained silent in my hand. No messages, no calls. For now. I didn't send a final email. I didn't leave instructions. I didn't offer warnings that would be dismissed as overreaction or ego. Silence. I had learned. Carries more weight when the system is already in motion, and some consequences don't need to be announced. They simply arrive. 47 minutes later. My phone lit up. I didn't need to check the name. I already knew who it was. I let it ring twice before answering. Cressida. What did you do? The voice on the other end wasn't the same one from the conference room. The calm detachment was gone. In its place was something tighter, controlled, but strained. I'm not sure what you mean. I replied. A brief pause. Like he was deciding how much to say. There's an issue at the Northside facility, said Daniel Mercer. We just received a notice. Access has been suspended. The landlord is refusing entry pending contract verification. I said nothing. Our equipment is inside. He continued. Faster now. Critical equipment. We have a client deployment scheduled next week. We can't access anything. I leaned slightly against my car. Listening, the Northside facility wasn't just another storage site. It held 3 months of backup inventory and the only calibrated testing unit prepared for a major launch. Without it, timelines didn't shift. They collapsed. I didn't do anything, I said calmly. That's not possible. He snapped. We had full access this morning. You had access under my authorization. I corrected. Keeping my tone even, my termination voided that continuity. Silence followed. Not confusion this time. Recognition. We own the lease, he said. More quietly now. You leased the space, I replied. The operational rider is attached to the acting facilities director. It requires the original signatory for temporary transfer of access. Another pause. Longer. I could hear movement in the background, a door closing. His voice dropped when he spoke again. Fix it. There it was. Not a request, not quite an order either. Urgency. I can't, I said. I no longer represent Aurelian Logistics Group. You could have said something, he added, frustration creeping back in. You knew this would happen. I looked out across the parking lot, watching someone walk past without noticing me. I tried, I said. It just wasn't considered important. He didn't respond immediately. In the silence, the situation spoke for itself. No raised voices, no dramatic confrontation, just a system reacting exactly as it was designed to, and for the first time since that meeting. The consequences had become visible. I stayed where I was, letting the quiet settle before I spoke again. There was no benefit in rushing the explanation. If anything, clarity required space. The access isn't controlled by the company account. I said, it's tied to the original signatory on the operational agreements. What does that mean? Exactly, Daniel Mercer asked. His voice lower now, more careful. It means the landlord doesn't recognize internal titles. I replied. They recognize continuity. The person who negotiated the terms, who maintained the relationship, who holds authorization to approve temporary transfers. Another pause. That person is you, he said. Yes. I didn't add emphasis. I didn't need to. For efficiency. Those agreements were structured to avoid disruptions. I continued. Single point of contact, direct authorization. It worked because it was consistent. And now, he asked, now there's a break in that continuity. I said. My termination removed the authorized link. Without that, access defaults to suspension until verification is completed. That's ridiculous, he said. Though there was less certainty behind it now. We have legal teams. We have documentation. You do, I agreed. But the clauses require acknowledgement from the original signatory for interim access. Otherwise, The landlord is obligated to pause operations to avoid liability. I could hear him exhale. Slower this time. How long does verification take? Under standard review, I said. Several weeks, possibly longer, depending on how many locations are affected. And how many are affected? He asked. I didn't answer immediately. More than one. I said finally. Silence returned. But it felt different now. Not defensive, not dismissive, calculating. Everything I had built over 7 years had never been designed to create leverage. It had been designed to prevent failure, redundancies, safeguards, relationship-based agreements, each layer added to ensure stability. But stability has a condition. It depends on understanding what holds it together. And all of this, he said slowly, was attached to your role. No? I replied. It was attached to my authorization. The distinction mattered. Roles can be reassigned. Authorization, once removed, doesn't transfer automatically. And that was the point where the situation stopped being theoretical. It became operational. If you think the CEO did the right thing by firing someone he believed was replaceable, go ahead and comment agree. But if you believe that decision was careless, and that the consequences unfolding now were inevitable, then show it with a like on this video. By mid-afternoon, the shift became official. The call didn't come from Daniel Mercer this time. It came from the board. A formal email first, then a scheduled virtual meeting within the hour. No delay, no attempt to route communication back through internal channels. That alone said more than any explanation could. When the screen connected, the tone was different immediately, controlled, measured, but not defensive. The chair of the board spoke first. Cressida, thank you for making time. We'd like to understand the situation. Not what happened. Not what I had done. What they had missed. It was a subtle distinction, but an important one. I can walk you through the structure, I said. They nodded, so I did. I explained the decentralized network, the secondary facilities, the relationship-based agreements that had been built over time, not through departments, but through consistency. I outlined how authorization had been designed to prevent disruption, not create dependency. I shared documentation, contracts, clauses, nothing hidden, nothing exaggerated, just the system as it existed. The CEO was not aware of this level of dependency. One board member said after reviewing the files, I reported it in quarterly summaries. I replied calmly. It was categorized as low risk. Why low risk, another asked. Because continuity was assumed. I said, and I was not considered a point of failure. That answer stayed in the air longer than expected. There was no argument, no attempt to redirect responsibility, just a quiet recognition settling across the call. Corporate language often reduces people to roles, to interchangeable units. It works well in theory, efficient, scalable, until the structure underneath doesn't align with that assumption. Understood. The chair said finally, what would be required to restore temporary access? There it was. Not blame, not reaction. A shift toward resolution. And more importantly, a shift in who was now asking the questions. I didn't rush to answer right away. The situation didn't require urgency from me anymore. It required accuracy. The structure wasn't built around control. I said, it was built around continuity. The board remained silent, listening. Most of the facilities operate under relationship-based agreements. I continued, not just legal documents, but working trust between consistent parties. That's why a single point of authorization was maintained. It reduced friction, ensured faster decisions, and prevented operational delays. And now that point is gone. One of them said, for the moment, yes. I replied, which triggers the safeguard clauses. I pulled up one of the agreements and shared the relevant section. These clauses weren't designed to restrict access. I explained, they were designed to protect it. If continuity is interrupted, the system defaults to verification before allowing further activity. It's a stability mechanism. So the suspension we're seeing, another member said slowly, is automatic. I finished. Not initiated, not escalated, just enforced. That distinction mattered because it removed intent from the equation. No sabotage, no retaliation, no hidden action taken after I left. Only a structure responding exactly as it had been written to do. The facilities, the inventory, the equipment, everything is still intact, I added. Nothing has been lost. Nothing has been altered. Access is simply paused until the authorization chain is restored or legally reassigned. And without that, the chair asked. Each agreement would need to be reviewed individually, I said. Revalidated with the landlords, possibly renegotiated depending on their requirements. That could take weeks. It likely will, I said. The room grew quiet again. But this time, it wasn't uncertainty. It was understanding, for years. The system had worked without interruption, quietly, consistently, without drawing attention. It had never demanded recognition because it had never failed. Now, for the first time, it was being noticed, not because something had gone wrong, but because something essential had been removed. And in that absence, the structure had begun to speak for itself. I let the silence settle before offering anything further. They didn't need persuasion. They needed options. There are two paths forward, I said. No one interrupted. The first is immediate stabilization. I continued. I return in a limited capacity as an independent consultant. Temporary authorization is reinstated under a defined scope. I transfer access properly, document the full structure, and train a successor over a fixed period. How long, the chair asked? 60 days? I replied. That allows for continuity without dependency. And the second option, we proceed without me. I said. Full legal review of each agreement. Direct negotiation with every landlord. Reassignment of authorization through formal channels. That timeline, another member asked. 8 to 12 weeks, possibly longer depending on responsiveness. I said. During that period, access remains restricted. Operational delays would extend across multiple facilities. No one spoke immediately after that. I didn't add anything else. No emphasis. No pressure. Just the framework. What would your terms be? The chair asked finally. Higher consulting rate. I said. Clearly defined responsibilities. No reinstated title. No internal reporting structure. Only the authority necessary to complete the transition. And after the 60 days, I step away. I said. All authorizations transferred. No remaining dependencies. There was a pause, but not hesitation, calculation. This wasn't about restoring a position. It wasn't about recognition or correction. It was about restoring function. You'll send a formal proposal, the chair asked. I will, I said. The call ended without ceremony. No agreement yet, no rejection either, just a decision forming on the other side. For the first time that day, everything was no longer uncertain. It had been reduced to a choice, not emotional, operational. The call came later that evening. This time, it wasn't routed through assistants or scheduled in advance. It came directly, without formality. I answered after a brief pause. Cressida, said Daniel Mercer. His voice was quieter than before, not strained, not urgent in the same way, but different, measured. You could have warned us, he said. I didn't respond immediately. There was no accusation in his tone this time, just something closer to reflection. I did. I said, it just didn't carry weight. He exhaled slowly. I misjudged the dependencies. He admitted. I assumed the systems were transferable, that nothing was tied that tightly to one person. That assumption works, I replied, when the structure is designed that way. And this one wasn't. He said, no. I said, it was designed for continuity, not interchangeability. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, just deliberate. I wasn't aware of the authorization clauses. He added, they were documented. I said, but they weren't prioritized. Another pause followed that. I see that now. He said, it wasn't an apology, not in the traditional sense. There was no direct acknowledgement of fault, no attempt to correct the earlier tone, but it was closer than anything I had expected. I'm not calling to argue, he continued. I just needed clarity. You have it, I said. Silence again. But this time it felt settled. I've reviewed the options you presented to the board, he said. They're leaning toward the consulting arrangement. That would restore access immediately. I replied. Yes, he said, and limit long-term exposure. There was a shift in how he spoke now. More precise, less performative. I should have handled the termination differently, he added after a moment. I let that sit. I'm not interested in proving you wrong. I said, I'm interested in being accurate. He didn't respond right away. Then, quietly, understood. That word carried more weight than anything said earlier in the day. Not because it fixed anything, but because it acknowledged something real. We ended the call shortly after that. No raised voices, no resolution beyond what had already been set in motion. Just a recalibration, not of roles, but of understanding. The next morning, I signed the consulting agreement. The terms were exactly as outlined. A defined scope, a higher rate, no reinstated title, no return to internal hierarchy, just a clear boundary between what I would do and what I no longer represented. When I arrived at the Northside facility later that day, the notice was still posted on the entrance. The landlord met me there in person. No tension, no confrontation, just a quiet verification of identity, followed by a short exchange of documents. Once authorization was confirmed, the notice came down. Access was restored in minutes. Inside, everything remained exactly as it had been left. Equipment secured, inventory untouched, systems waiting. There was no damage to repair. No crisis to resolve, only a pause that needed to be lifted. Over the following weeks, I worked through each location methodically, not rushing, not improvising. Every agreement was reviewed, every authorization properly transferred. Documentation was updated, not expanded. The goal wasn't to rebuild the system, it was to make it sustainable without me. They assigned a replacement early in the process, a capable operations manager, attentive, precise, willing to ask questions others had overlooked. I trained her directly, not just on procedures, but on context, why the structure existed the way it did, where flexibility was allowed, and where it wasn't, which relationships mattered, and why consistency often carried more weight than authority. She listened carefully. That was enough. Inside Aurelian Logistics Group, changes began quietly. There were no announcements, no public corrections. But policies shifted. Termination procedures were reviewed. The phrase key person dependency started appearing in internal reports. I heard about that later. I never asked for confirmation. It wasn't necessary. What mattered had already been understood. My interactions with Daniel Mercer remained minimal, professional, direct. There were no attempts to revisit the past, no effort to redefine what had happened. We focused only on completion. 63 days after signing the agreement, the final transfer was complete. All authorizations reassigned. All documentation delivered. No unresolved dependencies. On my last day, I handed over a single master key, one that represented access not just to a facility, but to a system that had been clarified, structured, and finally understood. There was no audience, no closing speech, no acknowledgement beyond a signed document, and that was enough. As I walked out, there was no escort this time, no tension in the air, just a quiet sense of closure that didn't require recognition. People often expect moments like this to be dramatic, to end with confrontation or visible reversal, but it wasn't like that. Nothing collapsed, nothing was taken down, everything simply adjusted. I didn't win anything. I didn't need to, because the system had already done what it was designed to do. And in the end, the only thing that changed was clarity. Some things don't need to be defended to be understood. They just need to be removed long enough to be seen. If you would have made the same choice I did, returning calmly, completing the transition, and walking away with clarity instead of revenge, right? Yes, so I know I wasn't alone in that decision. If you would have chosen differently, maybe refusing to help, Or letting the company face the full consequences, then write, refuse to help. And if you're still thinking about it, weighing both sides, just write maybe. Sometimes the hardest decisions aren't about being right, but about who you choose to be when it matters most. Through this story, I've drawn 3 important lessons. First lesson: true value is not defined by titles or recognition, but by the systems and impact you quietly build over time, things people often overlook until they're gone. Second lesson: never underestimate the invisible roles or hidden dependencies in any organization, because what seems replaceable on the surface can actually be critical at its core. Third lesson: how you choose to act in difficult moments matters more than the situation itself staying calm. Professional and principled will always outlast anger or the need to prove a point. I've realized that sometimes you don't need to defend your worth. Life has a way of revealing it when the time is right. What about you? Did this story give you a different perspective? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your insight could help someone else see their own situation more clearly. If this message resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Together, we're building a community where every story has meaning and every voice truly matters.